This program has been funded by a grant from Criterion Group, whose companies provide investment management services to mutual funds, individuals, and institutional investors.
One of the phenomena of the last few years is Rambo. I wonder how many of you have seen a Rambo movie. Do y'all know Rambo? One of the things that happened to me is I caught one late one night. That's the one where the sheriff, the dirty, rotten sheriff, throws him out of town. He's the war hero. Rambo is the war hero, and the sheriff throws him out of town, and he's a victim. He's an innocent victim. And they treat him, and then they take him back, and they strip him, they shame him at the police station. And it's the most powerful thing, watching him get revenge. He finally blows up the whole city. He simply annihilates the whole city. And I watched that thing with utter fascination. When it came on again, I watched it again and again. And what I want to tell you is that's that little kid. That's that little kid inside of us, getting revenge. That's that little kid that was humiliated and beaten in some cases, abandoned and abused in some cases. And it's what is the fascination to that violence? The fascination to the, and Rambo gets even. He's the victim of injustice. He's helpless. They interrogate him, they strip him, they shame him. To me, it's just one of the most powerful kind of reenactments. And why millions are attracted to that is because of the thesis of this series, the kind of abuse that people have been put through that is considered to be normal. A great deal of it is considered normal in this society. And I have been trying to tell you that what we're not about in this series is to talk about normal. There is no such thing as normal. What we're talking about, because if you're normal, you're the norm. Everybody's got to be compared to you. What we're talking about is functionality. A fully functioning, vitalized, spontaneous human being has all their powers available to them, power to know, the power to love, the power to feel, the power to be empathetic, the power to express, the power to imagine, the power to create. When all that works well, you are functional. When it doesn't work, you're dysfunctional. That's as simple as I can make it. When it works well, you're functional. When it doesn't work, you're dysfunctional. Now, what we've been establishing is we've looked at the healthy family, a healthy, functional family. We looked at a dysfunctional family. We looked at the compulsive family last week. And I told you that in compulsive families, whatever the compulsion is, could be alcoholism, could be drug abuse, could be fearaholic, an anxiety-ridden mama who creates tension in this family system by worrying all the time. So everybody's wandering around being careful about not telling mama because mama can't handle it. Mama's too fragile to handle it. Mama is addicted to her hypochondriasis. Mama is addicted to her illness. And that will dysfunction a system every bit as much as alcoholism. A rageaholic father, addicted to his rage. We're going to look at that tonight in the Persecuted. The violent families. And there's plenty of violence that gets minimized. Fathers screaming and yelling at children. I've done it in my own family. I never understood it as violence. I guarantee you it's violent. When my own daughter said to me one night, "I'm scared of you," and when I used to teach in high school and loved it when those kids were scared of me, I could control them. That's violence. That's violence, and it's accepted violence in our culture. It's accepted as normal. And it's not normal. It's causing severe problems. Those statistics I gave you in the first program, the soul murder that's going on. Tonight we're going to talk about 34 million women, adult women, who were sexually molested in childhood. That's the number, the figure we've got in this society of women that were abused sexually in childhood. 34 million adult women. 10 million people are the victims of violence in their own families in the United States of America. Now, it's too long we keep denying all this and refusing to look at what the source of it is, and the source of it is the family. The source of it is the family. It gets set up in families. The addictions, rageaholic, the addiction to power and to violence, those are addictions. Now, I told you that once you have that addict, whoever it is, workaholic, kids act out as much with workaholic fathers as they do with alcoholic fathers. It will dis-ease the family every bit as much as alcoholism. It's a serious disorder that kills people. People work themselves to death. Eating disorders. We talked about all that last week. Kills people. The whole family system is violated by that. Everybody adapts to that stress like a healthy organism naturally does. You go into fight-flight response. Now, I gave you Sharon Wegsnyder's work last week, and that's somewhat oversimplified. The roles in the family system are really much more complicated than that. Remember, we talked about the controlling addict. Now, this is a family. This is an actual family. I've got their permission to put them up here. This is an actual family. The addict, the compulsive father, is addicted to alcohol and drugs, but he's also addicted to work. One of the things you're going to see in a lot of these sexually abusing parents is they're addicts. They're addicted to work. Most of them are highly addicted to work. Most of them are addicted to religion. They're addicted to religion, addicted to sex and power, addicted to rage. See, once you're set up for compulsivity, I told you all, I put the cork in the bottle 20 years ago. That's just the beginning of the problem. That is just the beginning of the problem. That's just stopping and behavior modifying one part of the problem. I was set up for addiction in my family through abandonment by my father, through certain forms of emotional abuse, through certain kinds of neglect, just as my own parents were. But that's not the point. So here's a family, here's the addict. Now here is the codependent. Remember we talked about the chief enabler or the codependent? But she or he is also an addict. We'll see that in the 7th program where we talk about the most common family illness. Will be the one that's addicted to a certain kind of person. Addicted to destructive relationships. Addicted to destructive relationships. And let's say in this case it's mama. She gets her needs met through the children, by being a mother, through work, through worry. She's addicted to worry. Worry, 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 worry. Remember? We said instead of beating the drum, she worries. Okay? That's the way she distracts herself from her denial of her husband's dysfunctionality. That she's enraged at her husband. But to bring it up would be terribly unpleasant. To bring it up would risk losing the family structure. So mama goes on with her religion and righteousness, and everybody at church pats her on the back and tells her to keep a stiff upper lip, and that she's a martyr in her own time. She's a martyr, I guarantee you. That's one of her roles. Now that's a role. That's a role. That's not her reality. Remember we started talking about there's only one sorrow in the first program? The sorrow of not being a saint. That is, the sorrow of not being the person you were meant to be. The sorrow of living this life and going to your death and never knowing who you are. That is the greatest sorrow, of being out of touch with your own reality, your own feelings, so that you never know who you are. So a person can be in this role of super responsible, enabler, martyr all their life. Then look at what's open to the kids. This is the lost child. They really didn't want this child. And that kid gets it early on. Or this may be the last child. And see, that child that's one role available to her. She may be an extension of her dad, carrying her dad's shame. She may be the problem addict. Remember I told you that the kid will act out to try to keep her family together or his family together. A kid will feel that this relationship is real bad, so this kid gets in big trouble. Why? Because when the child gets in big trouble, the parents go back together again. That was some of the early work that Murray Bowen did on schizophrenia, where he began to bring the parent in and then the parents in, and he'd find that the parent's marriage was better while the kid was sick. Or he'd find that the kid would get real bad off when the mother would come. But that the child then, by acting out and scapegoating the family, was serving a function of keeping the family together. Or that the child was carrying the family's rage and pain and acting it out for the family. That's what these roles are. See, remember, the family is a system. And like any system, it has its own needs. So if the family has all this rage and pain, but nobody's expressing it, then one of the kids will act it out and become the scapegoat and act it out. Now, what I want you to see is that you can act out a lot of roles. This is the lost child, the extension of dad, the problematic, the overachiever, and the designated patient. A person can be all those roles simultaneously. In my own family system, I am my dad's dad. I was my dad's dad. At AA meetings, they'd call me a block off the old chip. My dad abandoned me as a child, literally abandoned me. I mean, he just wasn't there. And there have been generations of that in my family, I think, and it's still going on. How multi-generationally, when one person is abandoned, they will often act it out by abandoning their own children. My brother was abandoned. So there's something about, but in my case, I was mom's surrogate because there was no man in the house. I moved up to be the emotional husband. I was my brother's father. These are the roles that I played. I was the scapegoat while I was a drinking alcoholic. I was the hero when I went to the seminary to be a priest. And then after that, by being successful, being on TV. So my role is to give the family a sense of dignity. But I still don't have any reality if I don't get onto that. What I found is I was doing all these wonderful things and feeling nothing. Just acting out my role. So one kid can be mom's surrogate spouse, overachiever, addict, confidant, enabler, perfect one. Be the perfect one. See, the system needs a good one. The system needs a moral one. Or the system needs a little parent. My brother didn't have a parent, so I could be his parent. Or a hero. Then mom's scapegoat, and one kid may be both mom and dad's scapegoat. That is, one kid will get beaten in the family more than any of the others. And this kid is set up as the scapegoat. This kid may be the reason they had to get married. And as the marriage gets worse and worse, they both get angrier and angrier. And so they take it out on this kid who was the one they were pregnant with. So this kid can be mom's scapegoat, dad's scapegoat, the lost one, the perfect one, the victim, the martyr, the enabler, the overachiever. Now, I want you to see that if you don't know about this kind of material, you can literally be acting out your life and never know who you are. And carrying that system without ever knowing that you're in a role and that you're not in your own reality. Remember I talked about soul murder and shame and how people lose their own reality, and that's the crisis in the family today? Now, let me show you one other thing, and this will really impact what we're doing tonight. I've talked about boundaries when I talked about the healthy family. That a healthy family has semi-permeable boundaries. You can let people in, you can let people out. The family itself is open. In sick families, the family is very closed. We'll talk about the incestuous family tonight. It's very closed. Very patriarchal and very closed. Nothing gets in and nothing gets out. And very little information comes in and very little information comes out. It's like there's a boundary around the whole family. See, who do you talk to? Who can you talk to? What are the rules of your family? How do you bring information into the family? Or in this family, we don't bring that kind of information in. We don't talk psychology in this family. So we're not going to have any psychological information. And the dad, the tyrant, may decide that we have no psychological information in this family. Or dad, the tyrant, may decide there'll be no religious information in this family. Or there'll be no sexual information in this family. Or whatever. That's a boundary. Then there are boundaries within the family, and this is what is called enmeshment, or confluence, or confusion. That is, here's mom, here's dad, mom's red, dad's black, here's one of the kids green, here's another kid orange, here's another kid blue. Do you see how little of their reality there is in that graphic? This is all that there is of mother's individuality, or daddy's individuality, or the youngest kid, or the middle kid, or the oldest kid. The rest of it is called the undifferentiated ego mass. The undifferentiated ego mass. That is, it's all thrown together. It's like a big, Terry Kellogg calls it a great big bowl of porridge in the center of the house. And see, mother comes along one day and she's got rage, but there's nowhere to express it, so she throws it in there. Daddy comes along one day and he's full of shame, but he's got nobody to talk to because shame is private and you guard it and you never talk about it and you never show anybody, so he throws it in there. Somebody's got fear. The kids are terrified that mom and daddy are going to break up and leave them, so that gets thrown in there. So one day you're coming along for supper and you take yourself a big pot of porridge and you eat that lump of shame. So here you are carrying your father's shame around. Or I've carried my father's disdain of women around. That wasn't mine. I didn't sit there and decide I disdain women. There was a part of me that I've acted that out in the early part of my life. And I've been carrying that. And you see what's important about understanding family systems is getting your own boundaries. See, people in this system don't have any boundaries. Now, physical abuse can do this. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. If somebody can run up and slap you across the face anytime they feel like it because they are your parent, with the implication that they own you, then your physical boundary, the very boundary that you're in this world with, the philosopher Heidegger says we're in the world by way of a body. I am somebody. That's my grounding. People who have been physically abused often have a sense of unreality. Women who've been sexually abused have a sense of unreality. They just kind of think they're crazy. Nothing seems quite real around them because their bodies have been violated. Bodies have been violated. By the way, 80% of the prostitutes that have been studied have been sexually abused or physically abused. 80% of the drug-addicted girls that we've studied in Los Angeles have had some sexual abuse, mild sexual abuse, or some kind of real violent neglect or emotional abuse. Remember, the setup for addiction is abuse of any kind, abandonment, neglect, and enmeshment. Enmeshment means you're carrying somebody else's feelings, so you don't know what your own feelings are. Remember, we said an addiction, a compulsivity, is a pathological relationship to a mood-altering event, experience, or thing that has life-damaging consequences, okay? And that an addiction is a way to distract. A workaholic man doesn't feel his feelings because he's so busy mentally working, so he can distract himself from his feelings. I didn't talk about it when I was an intellectual teaching in university. I did that all the time. I could just be abstract. I did mention that. I could be abstracted. I could be out of my feelings by intellectualizing all the time, by being intellectual and compulsing on intellectuality. Finding new texts and philosophers was a way not to be in my own reality. So families with enmeshed boundaries are setups for addiction, for compulsivity. Remember what I'm saying in this series, that the crisis in the family today is a crisis of compulsivity. That is the disease of our time, the dis-ease of our time. It's the disease of the things we eat and drink, the way we sleep, sex, our entertainment, our work. Those are the things that we're compulsive around because we are set up in these family systems for that kind of compulsivity. And remember the little chart last week of how the first program of the public self and the private self, and how by the time people get to midlife, they're in this act, they're in this performance. They don't even know what their feelings are anymore, their needs are, their wants are. Nothing will do this any worse than physical abuse, by the way, and sexual abuse. So I want to turn to that now. I want to talk about physical abuse first. There is a massive amount of physical abuse in our society. By the way, tonight I want you to I want to have a question period, so if you have any questions, you might jot them down, and a little bit they'll ask you to move them over and bring them up here. But the idea is that we have long traditions of physical abuse. I talked to you about physical abuse, about Hitler being beaten every day in his family system. And of course the thing is, people will sit out there and say, well, I was beaten, but I didn't become an abuser. I didn't become a criminal. I didn't become a mass murderer. And frequently the people telling me that just don't even realize what they're saying. When I look at them and I see their dissociations, or I see their lack of feelings, or how much they're in a role or a script, or there's some workaholic with their family over here lonely and abandoned, and they're in denial about that. They've minimized their impact of their addiction on their family, their workaholic addiction on their family, and the kids are all, you know, in pain over it and feel abandoned by it, and that daddy will have all kind of ways to deny that and to minimize. See, part of the illness is denial and minimizing. In fact, a lot of victims of physical abuse don't know they were victimized. Don't know they were victimized. I would bet that there are a bunch of you in this audience that were physically abused who don't really know you were physically abused. Or you'll say, well, just a couple of times. Just a couple of times they really went crazy and knocked me around. See, that's physical abuse. Or if you saw your sister being slapped to the point where it was clearly out of any need for discipline. And please understand me, I don't personally like corporal punishment. I think on occasion, little Guinevere's out in the street and a car's coming. A pat on the bottom could be an effective intervention. But to take her inside and whack her 10 times has absolutely no evidence whatsoever that that's helpful to her as a person, or that discipline, which means a learning, a teaching. Disciplina in Latin means to teach people something. What does that teach somebody? What it teaches is that when you get the power and the rod, you get to whack somebody too. That's exactly what it teaches. Because then the child is told, I am doing this for your own good. I'm doing this for you. This is an act of love. As I hurt your body, it hurts to be hit. It hurts to be hit. And somehow we have just glossed this over. I wrote up one day on a crisis hotline. You cannot believe the stuff that was coming in. The physical abuse that was coming in on crisis hotline. And if you don't believe me, call somebody down there and just ask them. The kind of abuse, the burning, scratching, slamming heads, crushing heads, kicking, hanging a kid upside down, cattle prods. 10 million people are the victims of their own family's violence a year, and the number is growing. I've got the stats in Harris County, and it was started off like about 71. It was 30 per month, and then 72 it was 60 a month, and 90 a month by 74, 187 a month by 75. The abusing family, Blair and Rita Justice, wrote a book some years ago, but I think they're top people in the field. And that book still has valuable kind of stuff on abusive families and the kinds of things that happen in abusive families. 1 out of 8 women are beaten by their husbands. You know what the old rule of thumb was? How wide your stick could be that you beat your wife with. That was the rule of thumb. I wrote down this from the Harvard Business Review. This is an article that was written in 1973 by R.J. Light, talking about colonial America. Father had the right not only to kill his child, but to call on colony officers to assist him. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not a historian. But this is written for the Harvard Educational Review, November 1973, number 143. That as late as 1892, 200 foundlings and 100 dead infants were found in the streets of New York. That it was not until the late 1890s, in a case of a girl called Mary Ellen, a 9-year-old, that they found chained to her bed in a tenement building. You know who found her? The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. You know why? Because there was no society for the prevention of cruelty to children at that time. See, when we understand that women were not allowed universally to vote until 1929, 8, what was it? I mean, that's awesome in the history of the human species. Then we begin to see that this history of the idea of owning children, that you have the possession of your children, you have the right to own your children and to beat your children if necessary. And if you grab somebody, if you see them beating a kid, you're not going to make it. Those courts they'll support that right. And I am fighting against that. I am trying to raise consciousness about this kind of issue. Because what we know is, here's a profile of an abuser. He's an isolated person. He or she's an isolated person. And usually if the father is beating the kids, the mother will be collusive in some way. She will not want, she'll be so traumatically bonded, he'll be beating her up too, and she's traumatically bonded to him in some way. Because one of the worst things about physical abuse is that it's addictive. Say that again. One of the worst things about physical abuse is that it's addictive. It's addictive. People get bonded to physical abuse. I worked with a person who had, when she came to me, had married her 5th brutal alcoholic. And her father was a brutal alcoholic. 5 brutal alcoholics. See the addiction to the punishment? There's a bonding to the punishment. And it gets set up in the family system. See, the child gets set up. It's almost like a bottom line tolerance. It's all she's ever seen is men who knock women around. So if 1 out of 8 women are being beaten by their husbands, you see, this is an enormous problem. It's an enormous problem. The profile of physically abusing parent, he was deprived of basic mothering. There's a deep sense of a loss of being cared for. Usually these people demand that the children care for them. Remember I said if these 2 people get married and they're both incomplete, they're both trying to get, then as soon as they get married, they realize neither one of them can complete the other one because they're both trying to get. Neither one of them can give. So then they take these kids and say, okay, now you're going to give to us. We're going to get from you. You owe us your life. See, what I'm telling people is, for God's sake, don't have children if you're not prepared for it. I mean, who is prepared for it? 17-year-olds can have kids without any training. You have to do more to be a garbage man than have a kid. It's an incredible problem, folks. It's our greatest natural resource, our children. Your children are not your children. They're life going on. Life goes forward. And it's a tremendous problem. Shame-based, these profile of parents, shame-based, high need for nurturing. They lack empathic ability. Really, they're sociopathic or psychopathic in that sense. They're cut off from their feelings so bad, they have no sense of the pain of the other person. They don't have a good sense of the pain of the other person. Denial of problem, denial that it's a problem in the family. And the collusive one, if it's the mama beating the kids, although it's more men usually than women, if the mama beating the kid, then the other parent will be in collusion with it, either passively by not looking at it or actively by just allowing it to be. Because she doesn't want to get a divorce or he doesn't want to get a divorce. And who would take care of them? See, that's part of the way that traumatic bonding gets going. When we talk about sexual abuse in a minute, often the child who's being sexually abused, it'll be by the more nurturing parent. So there's a bonding that gets set up after a person's abused. The person may feel guilty, let's say physical abuse. Or in my own personal boundaries, I don't think I'm a physical abuser of any chronic nature, but what I would do is I had such bad boundaries that I would let things go, let things go, let things go, let things go, and then all of a sudden go crazy with my children. You see, I don't have good boundaries. The boundary problems are I didn't know, I would allow them just to run roughshod over me, or if I started screaming and hollering as a daddy, I'd feel so bad that I would then let it go and let it go and let it go and let it go and let it go until I just couldn't take it anymore. And so you see the problem of my own fuzzy boundaries. And remember what I said in the second program, the third program? What good families need is disciplinarians. I told you that it was a crisis of discipline. that in dysfunctional families you have discipline, but it's undisciplined disciplinarians. The disciplinarians are undisciplined. So what the kid does is model that parent. Shame-based. Nothing creates shame worse than being slapped across the face, being physically abused. It is the most shaming thing, well, other than sexual abuse. And what happens often is that it's done in public. I saw a woman hit a kid in a shoe store 16 times the other day. Tried to stop her. She got furious at me. I was sitting having a haircut in Florida not long ago, and this girl began to describe how she physically punished her son. The kid had not eaten his lunch that she sent him to school with, and she told how she told him early in the day he was going to get it for that. And he'd come up to her and try to make the beds and make amends, and she said the little booger was just squirming. And he was telling this other person cutting hair, she finally hit him 16 times that night at 10 o'clock, right before bed. See, listen to there was an old woman who lived in a shoe. She had so many children, she didn't know what to do. She gave them somewhat porridge without any bread, and this is one of our fairy tale, and whipped them all soundly and sent them to bed. Isn't that good? What in the world? We've gone crazy. When we think that us big 17-foot, 9-inch tall giants knocking those little bitty people around, that there's some value in that, philosophically and educationally. That there's something good about that. You see, again, it's that presupposition that they're not persons. See, unless you become as little children, you cannot enter the kingdom, the Bible says. What about that? But they're not persons. They're just these little pieces of property that you own who have to be trained like animals. Not true. No data to support that whatsoever. The data is they're little persons from the very beginning. They have a sense of dignity. They feel all the same feelings we feel. So one of the most powerful, let me talk about sexual abuse just for a second, and then I want to tell you some of the ways people dissociate with that. 34 million women in this culture have been sexually abused. 1 out of 4, according to some statistics I've heard Terry Kellogg use. In the Life article magazine of December of '84, Cheryl McCall starts the article, there are perhaps 34 million of us in America, adult women who were victims of sexual abuse as children. It began for me when I was 9 years old. My brothers and sisters had been sent to bed. I was getting a special treat by being allowed to stay up and watch TV with my stepfather. I was reading our small-town newspaper and was puzzled about a word. What does assault mean? I asked my father. Is it like when the Three Stooges say, I've never been so assaulted in my life? He had a strange expression on his face. I'll show you what it means, he said. He took me into my parents' bedroom. My mother was waitressing the evening shift. He removed my yellow pajamas and took off my clothes. Nothing was ever the same for me again. The following day, I was afraid to go to my third grade classroom because I thought everyone could tell. But I couldn't go home because he was there. I climbed the fire escape on the side of the yellow brick school and clung to it all morning, shivering and weeping. When my teacher discovered me at lunchtime, she scolded me and told me that I was a bad girl. And I already knew that. See, the most terrible thing about sexual abuse and physical abuse is that you have, up to 8 years old, a magical, egocentric, non-logical person. That is, we know that from the work of Piaget, the great Swiss researcher. At least everybody fairly agrees on this. That children do not think rationally or logically till about 7 or 8. Next week when I talk about moral abuse, that's one of the points I'm going to make. You can't even introduce moral distinctions prior to 7 or 8. So calling kids good and bad are distinctions they just don't understand. They don't even have the structures for that. And I tell you, it's the hardest thing to stop. I saw a little girl the other day. I said, have you been a good girl? You know, you just do it automatically. But the most terrible thing that happens to us, you see, is that, well, when a person's been physically or sexually abused, is that egocentric child will say, I am bad. I am bad. I have done something bad for him to do that to me or her to do that to me. I must be terrible for them to do that to me. I'm working with a guy recently, and I just knew. I knew from some of his symptoms that he'd been physically abused. I said, did your dad knock you around as a kid? Tell me what happened. Oh, no, he said, Dad was tough. I said, what does that mean? Oh, he spanked us. We deserved it, though. I said, well, what'd you do? Tell me about that. He said, well, I can remember not making my bed for 10 days one time. I said, well, what happened to you with that? Well, he'd take us in and dunk our heads in the toilet and slap us across the face. Now, this is called denial and minimizing. See, you can't get this until you've heard a person do it just with a straight face. You can't get it, as I have sat in my office time and again and heard these horror stories, and the person's in complete denial about it and in dissociation about it. See, and that's what happens is to sexual victims, the dissociation is tremendous. Now, what does dissociation mean? It means you don't feel it anymore. You just go into fantasy. You just become numb. I remember as a kid, not that I was physically or sexually abused, but I can remember as a kid dissociating, saying, I'm never going to feel a feeling again. It's too painful to feel feelings. It's too painful to expect my dad to be there. I was disappointed over and over again. So what I learned was just don't feel anything. And if you can dissociate, that's an ego defense, and it's called dissociation. It means you just go away from the memory. Now, this is why it's so difficult to deal with sexually abused women, for example, or men. But sexual abuse in males tends to be later, although more and more evidence is coming out that what we would call mild abuse. See, 1 out of 100 families, we're talking about severe abuse, actual penetration. 1 out of 10 mild abuse in this culture. Now, what is that? It's inappropriate touching. It may be inappropriate exposure. I'm dealing with 2 people whose mamas used to wash them at 4 and 5 and wash their private parts. I consider that sexually abusing, and I guarantee you the impact on their life is very clear that that's the case. Or mama controlling this child's life, or having a special relationship with the child, using the child as her little darling to meet her needs rather than the child's needs. That's very abusive, and usually having a bad relationship with the father. Bad relationship with the father, so she turns to the child and uses him to fulfill her needs. That's the way males get sexually abused. Sometimes listening to a mama's boy, you'll get almost the same kind of data as listening to a sexually abused woman. Same kind of consequences of that will seem to be there in terms of a lack of intimacy, lack of real good sexual identity. So what about sexually incest families, sexually abusing families? They tend to be, I'm going to give you some of the characteristics of those families. They tend to be highly controlling, disproportionate number are outwardly religious. If you've been following the McMartin trial and if you've followed some of these trials, it's incredible how these abusers, the pedophiles, will be so religious in their defense, and they'll have people from the church coming up and saying this man goes to church every Sunday. A disproportionate number are religious outwardly. Many are workaholics. Most hide deviant behavior from wives, colleagues, closest friends. One of the great researchers on this in Seattle, where there's a center, said one time, we want to kill deviant molesters like this until you recognize that one of them is somebody you know. Until you realize, until you hear that it's somebody that you knew or you played golf with or was in the club or whatever. Because this is not some kind of behavior that only goes into sociocultural grouping. It's almost always sexual addiction. You know, you heard me talk about sexual addiction last week, but I want to make a point. Not all sex addicts are deviants in this sense, that is, act out in child incest or in these ways. However, almost all of the acting out here is sexual addiction. Now, there can be other things. There can be rage. There can be reenactment. Sometimes a pedophile will reenact exactly what happened to him because 40 to 50% were sexually abused. So what comes out of sexually abusing and physically abusing families is you have an offender role that the person will continue to take a victim role, and a person will either remain a victim all their life, setting themselves up traumatically, bonding with abusive people, or they'll do just the opposite. They'll go to the victim role. They will go to the victim role. I mean, they'll go to the persecutor role, the offender role. And they will become an offender because they were victimized, almost a way to handle the feeling of powerlessness and victimization. Did we have some questions? Why is there so much abuse in families? Why is there so much violence in our society? Well, it's the whole thesis of this TV series, that a great deal of what we call normal child parenting or whatever is being carried down multi-generationally from parent to parent. What I showed you in the first program about Hitler, how could Hitler happen? How could a madman come along and take the most advanced intellectual nation of the world? Unless the German family structure in its autocratic, authoritarian, collective, repressed rage. Hitler was the gang leader of a bunch of adolescents. That's what Erik Erikson believes. He never became the father, he was the brother. The Fuhrer was the brother. And it was like they bandied together, acting out this rage that they had been subjected to as children. Alice Miller's book, For Your Own Good, one of the most powerful, awesome things I've ever read on Hitler's childhood. How Hitler's father beat him every day. There's data that his father was the bastard child of a Jewish landlord. There's some incredible things as we look at the scenario of reenactment. There is so much violence in our society because we do not allow anger in our families. And so what I told you in the first and second program is that if rage can come out, it's finished. It is repressed rage that gets reenacted. It's not hatred that's expressed that's the problem. It's hatred that's swallowed that's the problem. Traumatic, emotionally, an environment of emotional illness is not the trauma, it's the inability to talk about it to anybody. It's to have no witnesses and no allies and to be little and helpless and powerless. And just watch what murderers and people who victimize society do. They go to the innocent and they reenact what was done to them. And whenever we've studied these people, this is what we found. We found family systems that were violent. See, they live with violence, they become violent. So it's the point I'm trying to make. We've got to look at our families. And the point I really want to make tonight, it isn't them and us. And I'll make that in just a moment, but it's just a luxury to think of them and us. These perverts over here. These people who, we are the righteous and good ones, and they are the sick ones. See, we love to do that. And what we do is we create hopelessness, more hopelessness for those people and for ourselves. Because if what is the matter with them isn't human, then it is totally hopeless. And as we set ourselves up in our absolutized righteousness over here, see, there's no polarity. You can only be good. You can only be obedient. You can only be considerate. You can only be controlling of your feelings. You can't be spontaneous. You can't be sensual. You can't have vibrancy and inner criticalness and inner independence and creativity. So we keep this absolutizing hopelessness going on for the poor people that are the victims. And there are victims too. All of the judges and the preachers and the educators who keep this stuff going are victimizing those people just as much, and the rest of us who act like them and us and we can't identify with any of that we're not abusing our children too in some ways. Are the roles that you want to keep, are the roles that you want to keep, are there roles you want to keep or continue to play? Well, I don't think the role you want is your own reality, whatever that is. Now, of course, there are certain ritual, hello, how are you, social roles. I'm not going to vent my anger on you the moment I see you if I'm feeling angry. It's not appropriate. When the policeman stops you and gives you a ticket, I would probably suppress my anger at that moment, not repress it, but suppress it. The boss is walking by. I don't like the boss. Probably suppress my anger at that moment, playing like I'm happier on the job than I really am. There's a kind of a social role playing that we all, hello, how are you? Great to see you. We don't totally mean that, but it's socially acceptable. I think those roles are okay. What I hope ultimately is not to play any role at all except to be myself, to feel my own feelings. Remember those freedoms, to see what you see, to hear what you hear, to feel what you feel rather than what you're supposed to feel, to think what you think rather than what you're supposed to think, to want what you want rather than what you're supposed to want. That's how you be self-accepting and at one with yourself. And that's how to get the self back. What is your definition of addiction? Where have somebody been? I have said this about 10 times. Addiction is a pathological relationship to a mood-altering event, experience, or thing that has life-damaging consequences. Okay? And remember that the mood-altering is not just euphoric. Sex is euphoric, cocaine is euphoric, alcohol is euphoric, drugs are euphoric, banana cream pie is euphoric, Bluebell cookies and cream is euphoric. Those are obvious addictions, but they're not the only addictions. A mood-altering addiction is to vacuum 16 hours a day. When you hate your husband and you cannot get the anger out because you're so terrified to go it alone. You're so terrified of abandonment. So what you do in order to distract yourself from the feeling, what you do in order to mood alter the feeling is vacuum 16 hours a day. And then you don't have to deal with the feeling. Or work all the time if you're depressed and lonely, and let your kids carry your loneliness and your depression. And you can be vitalized by making money and having a lot of people be obedient to you or whatever. See, those are addictions, and they're mood altering. If you don't believe in spanking a child with a bare hand for discipline, how do you get their attention? Well, it isn't easy at times. And I didn't say I didn't believe in spanking them with a bare hand. What I said was there's a fine line between a pop on the bottom that is for their good and a pop on the bottom that's for my good. It's my bad mood about the office. It's my bad mood about my wife. It's my bad mood about something that's going on. And I fail to see why hitting a kid more than once is ever effective. I'm working with a guy in Los Angeles. His father was a Princeton University professor. Used to burn him quite a bit. But he would also lay him on the bed naked with his stick, and he would hit him. And if he moved a muscle, he would hit him again. Now, many people have been hit for crying, and then if you cry some more, they hit you some more. These are terrible things. And you see, that's the parent's own need to have an image of themselves as a good parent. So if your kid's crying, it's kind of you're out of control of them. And quit them crying, because then you won't think of yourself as a good parent. So I'll give you something to cry about. And you hit them so they'll stop crying. And, cannot believe the kind of splits that happen to people when this is done to them. When they're tiny little people and they're trying to make it in this world. You see, we're so accustomed to thinking of hitting as a way to solve problems when we're 5 times these people's height. And 5 times their weight. Why do we admit our defeat that we can't, as rational human beings, figure out ways to set environments for them and meet their needs without whacking them? See, I think it's because it's so ingrained, it is so deep in our culture. And then we've got this terrible stuff. Here's an article from People, July 8th, 1985, talking about the lawyers in the McMartin trial, how they would interrogate these children on the stand. And then here, I don't know whether this is true, but Courtney, they've talked about this 10-year-old girl who finally won a conviction, although the court case, the therapists think, will probably damage her as much as the sexual abuse. What the lawyer did to her in court will damage her as much as the sexual abuse. You see, our courts are not made for little children. But here, Courtney admits he is not an expert at defending child molestation cases, but he claims to have picked up points from a seminar sponsored by Los Angeles County Public Defender's Office. Children are insidious practice liars, asserts Mike Adelson, an 18-year-old veteran of the office who has led many of the seminars, instructing lawyers on how to frighten, cajole, and confuse children on the witness stands. You want the child to be intimidated, he told a packed lecture hall last year. Now, I don't know whether that's true, but man, this is People magazine, July 1985. What I really think is that there is truth to that, is that we don't believe children. And Freud, you know, one of the points that Alice Miller makes, Freud had about 80 women that he diagnosed as hysterical who invented fantasies about child abuse, that in the subsequent studies of those women, they were all abused sexually. He couldn't handle the idea that they were abused sexually. It just was so foreign to kind of the collective consciousness that we abuse children this bad. In the time I've been talking, every 2 minutes a child is sexually abused or physically abused in this country. Now, tell your children, if a child comes to you, here's some advice. Tell your child to believe that you believe them. Emphasize that the offender did something wrong, that it's not their fault. Because you see, the kid will take it on. And imagine a child believing that they're bad, living in the system. The average child abuser will abuse the child 80 times. And the average child molester will molest 73, on an average of 73 children. And what we think is that for every case that's reported, 9 are not, and some even go as high as 100 are not. So it's an enormous problem. Call the police or rape crisis center. In the case of incest, call your child protection agency. Don't confront the offender in your child's presence. Let the authorities do that. Take your child for a physical exam to reassure him or her that his or her body hasn't been harmed or changed. Allow your child to talk about it at his own or her own pace. Silencing children won't make them forget. Counseling is often helpful. Now, Alice Miller writes, the child is alone, this abused child, in their suffering, not only within the family, but also within their self. He or she cannot share their pain with anyone. They are also unable to create a place in their own soul where they could cry their hearts out. It's the most terrible thing that I know about, is child abuse. Physical and emotional child abuse. And I just think that it's important for us to realize that a lot of times we've minimized the abuse that happened to us, the spankings, the slappings, and if you catch yourself doing that to your own children, what you're dealing with is the parent inside of you, the child inside of you that never got to express that rage to the parent. Here's another thing Alice Miller says that's crucial. An abused child will not become either a criminal or mentally ill if at least once in his life he meets a person who clearly realizes that he is not the beaten, helpless child, but his environment is what was crazy. See, remember I said they're not bad people, they're bad rules and bad environments. They're crazy environments. To this extent, the knowledge or ignorance of society in the person of preachers, relatives, social workers, therapists, teachers, doctors, psychiatrists, official nurses can save or help to destroy life. Till now, society has protected the adult. We're in an offender-protected society. And blame the victim. We have been assisted in our blindness by theories conforming to the educational patterns of our great-grandparents, in which children were seen as creatures ruled by meanness and destructive drives, inventing deceitful and fanciful events, and offending or desiring sexually their innocent parents. In truth, each child tends to take the blame and responsibility for the cruelty of his parents due to his constant love for them. So we're talking about one of the saddest things I know about, folks. You talk about enmeshment. The victims of violence are dissociated. They often have split personalities. They have no affect. They have a lot of physical ailments. They will often have severe difficulty sexually, if they can perform sexually at all, if they've been victims of incest. Now, here's something William Lynch said. He said, our hopelessness increases because we isolate these people, and we increase their hopelessness. Their hopelessness is our own hopelessness. William Lynch wrote a book called Images of Hope. He's a Jesuit priest. And I'll be using him in our last program. he says their hopelessness is our own hopelessness, for it is a fact that it is the greatest hope of the victim that there is nothing wrong with them that is not human and is not present in some way in every other member of our race. We try to build these moats between the well and the ill, the just and the unjust, the saints and the sinners. You see, because most of these victims will either act out by being destructive, become prostitutes, and so we've got preachers up there condemning them, condemning the prostitutes and the people who are criminals when they've been criminally abused. And quit preaching honor of father and mother and start talking about family systems. We do this out of fear to convince ourselves of the enormous distance between us and them, and we build a corresponding vocabulary of labeling and contempt. Such a profound separation adds not to our hope, but to our hopelessness. The well impose impossible burdens of wellness upon themselves by widening these gaps. To me, this is profound. It's this absolutizing, this labeling that makes us create this distance, and those poor people are out there suffering, feeling terrible about themselves, full of shame and lost soul.